It's been more than 300 days since Russian military moved into Ukraine in February this year. The UN chief says he's hopeful the war will come to an end in 2023. But does NATO share this optimism? And what are the chances of a nuclear escalation? I'm Hassan Abdullah and I talk to David Weel, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. David Weel, good to have you on TRT World. We've had the UN Secretary General commenting recently that he hopes the war in Ukraine is going to come to an end next year. At NATO, you're constantly engaged in the process of threat assessments and so forth. Do you share that optimism?
Well, I share the hope. We all hope that this war will come to an end soon. And I think the quickest way for this war to end is for President Putin to stop this war in Ukraine and to pull back his troops into Russia. That would mean that the war is over in an instant. So that's my hope.
When we talk to the Russians, they say that NATO is basically using this as an opportunity to try and not just contain Russia, but to sort of, as they put it, harm it. And they're saying that NATO is one of the reasons that's causing the prolonging of this conflict. How do you respond to that?
Well, the reason for the prolonging of this conflict is the fact that Russia illegally has troops in Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation. And what NATO is doing, we are not a part of this conflict, but what NATO nations are doing is providing Ukraine with support so it can defend itself, as is delineated by the UN Charter. So Ukraine has the right to self-defense, to protect its sovereignty and to protect its people. And that's what NATO allies are doing, and where NATO is helping also with things like winter closing, support in cyberspace, etc. And we will continue to do so to support Ukraine.
Was there a failure on the part of NATO to actually predict the scope of this conflict? Because some of the people I've talked to, it seemed that they were of the view that perhaps there's this bluff from Moscow and that this is not going to happen, a sort of a full-scale military mobilization. So was there some sort of a failure?
I think on the NATO side we were very clear from the end of 2022 and also in the beginning of 2023, sorry, I'm mixing up the years now, 2021, 2022, that we gave off signals that we saw a worrying buildup of Russian troops around the Ukrainian border, that we also saw different preparations coming into play, so the pre-positioning of troops, the drafting of certain people, preparations being made, so we clearly gave off warnings before the 24th of February. But it's very difficult in the end to determine where someone's intentions lie. So we definitely saw something coming.
When you look at the situation from Moscow's perspective, the domestic challenges, especially for President Putin, when he talks about escalation, and when you look at the sort of situation he's in at the moment, what's NATO's assessment of the possibility of some sort of nuclear escalation, even if it's the use of tactical nukes?
Well, all the nuclear weapon states, including Russia, have continuously said that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must not be fought. So that is something that we very much hope that President Putin will adhere to in this conflict. He's also been told that the use of a nuclear weapon, even if a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, will have severe consequences. And at the same time, we have to remain vigilant. So we're looking at the readiness of the Russian nuclear forces, and we haven't seen a big change in the nuclear posture as of now. But as said, we remain vigilant, and this is a scenario that should be avoided at all costs.
Turkey has been trying to de-escalate the situation. How does NATO view Turkey's role in this whole scenario?
So I think Turkey was at the basis of the exchange of prisoners of war between Ukraine and Russia, and I think that's very admirable and really helps. Of course, you also have your role when it comes down to the Montreux Convention and maintaining the treaty in traffic of naval ships into the Bosphorus. Finally, of course, you're also brokering in the grain deal, as it's been called, that up until now has relieved a lot of people from suffering of food shortage. So I think those are all very much appreciated efforts by Turkey in trying to alleviate the pain that this war is causing.
Sweden and Finland are trying to become members of NATO. What are your expectations from Turkey in this regard?
So Turkey and Sweden and Finland will be great additions to NATO security. So that includes Turkish security. They're very capable partners already, invitees, and they will add to our common strengths in our collective defense. So from that standpoint, I think that ratification should happen as soon as possible so that we can invite them and integrate them into our alliance.
When you talk to the Turkish public, or even in the powers of corridor here in Ankara, there's a very common perception that NATO is perhaps not taking into account Turkey's security concerns. So, for example, one of the organizations, the YPG, which many NATO members acknowledge is the Syrian branch of the PKK terrorist organization, recognized by the US, EU, and so forth. A number of core NATO members continue to provide support, political support, economic support, military support to this organization. Do you then expect Turkey to sort of take assurances seriously?
Well, we do take Turkey's security concerns seriously. I mean, the region you're in at the moment with tensions to your east, to your south, and to the north now in the Black Sea is something we take very, very seriously. And I think that because you're referring also to Finland and Sweden, that the fact that these countries have entered into a trilateral agreement with Turkey to address these security concerns is a good sign of showing how serious they are being taken. So I understand that those trilateral talks are going in the right direction, that steps are being taken by Sweden and Finland to address these concerns, and hopefully that will lead to a rapid ratification of their membership.
But it's not just about Sweden and Finland. We have some current members of the NATO, the United States, for example. We have Belgium, that continue to provide assistance and open assistance in different ways. For example, military assistance to the YPG in Syria. In the case of Belgium, you will hear from powers of corridor here in Turkey, and you will see on television that supporters of the YPG continue to operate freely in a number of Western capitals. How do you go about addressing these Turkish concerns?
So when it comes down to NATO, NATO is not active in the fight against Daesh at this moment. So within NATO, we see terrorism as the main asymmetric threat that our alliance faces. And based on that, we have a counterterrorism action plan, which consists of 3 different pillars. One is awareness, so we need to know what's happening. The second one is to build capabilities, for example, in the field of counter-IED, counter-unmanned air systems. And the third one is in engagement. So we need to engage with our partners in the south and in the east to combat terrorism and to help them in capacity building. So that's what NATO is doing to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations.
I think when it comes to solidarity between members, that's one of the key concerns of NATO. How do you view the posturing by Greece at the moment, especially when you talk around the Aegean Sea?
So I don't want to comment on the posture of individual allies, as I speak on behalf of the alliance. But I surely hope that the tensions between those 2 allies, Greece and Turkey, will not escalate, and that you can find a resolve to these tensions in the short term, because it really benefits the alliance, especially in these times of tension, to have unity of effort. And that unity of effort should not be between nations, but should be to shield the alliance against potential aggression from outside.
Now, I can understand the organizational challenges NATO faces when sometimes some members pursue foreign policies that may be viewed as conflictual by other members. For example, the US statements on what's happening in the Aegean Sea and so forth. But then how do you go about addressing the concerns of a member that feels that perhaps it's being singled out because of its identity?
Well, NATO is an alliance of 30 and hopefully soon 32 democracies. And we all have our different interests, depending on where we are geographically, where we stand politically, where we come from historically. So discussions are not strange to a body like NATO. We cannot force any decisions. We need to come to a common agreement, to unanimity on everything we do in NATO. And we've been very successful at that. I mean, since 1949, this is still the strongest alliance that the world has ever seen. So those differences don't worry me. It would worry me if the member states that it concerns don't talk to each other anymore, because that's when we lose the ability to understand the other and to come to resolution.
You're hoping that the war in Ukraine ends soon. Surely there would be some sort of post-war planning. Can you share details of what sort of settlement that you have in mind? For example, what could be the status of Crimea? Is NATO going to push for the change of status when it comes to Crimea? Is it going to be the status quo that existed before February last year? What are going to be the sort of terms, roughly, of the post-war settlement?
So I think that is not up to NATO. This is a conflict that Russia started in Ukraine. It involves the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which involves Crimea as a part of Ukraine. So it's up to the Ukrainian government to determine what the potential parameters of a settlement in the end will be, and not up to NATO or other actors in this field.
When the conflict started, and when we look at the statements that came from the Ukrainian leadership, do you think Ukraine has had very high expectations from NATO in terms of the involvement NATO is going to bring about and so forth?
Well, I think that there's a few things that we did after the 24th of February as NATO. First of all, we shielded off the alliance to deter against any potential aggression from Russia against allies. I think that's the most important core task of NATO. That means shielding off the allies and making sure that we are safe. Then, in addition to that, we did what we could to assist Ukraine. And you've seen that over time, that assistance has shifted in its nature to fit the situation on the battlefield. So I think we all have an enormous amount of respect for the resilience that the Ukrainians have shown, the fight they've put up against this brutal aggression, and they deserve our assistance to defend themselves against that aggression.
Finally, when do you expect this conflict to come to an end?
Oh, I wouldn't do any predictions on that. There's nothing more unpredictable than war. You told me that NATO make a mistake in seeing this coming, and I told you that we could see the build-up. But once a war starts, it is a very difficult situation to determine what will be next. That's why I keep saying it's very, very important that we keep assisting Ukraine as long as the aggression lasts, so they can defend themselves.
David van Weel, thank you for joining us on TRT World.
Thank you.